This is Apologetics Profile, a podcast ministry of Watchman Fellowship, equipping the church, exhorting the non-believer, and exalting Christ. Here is your host, Watchman staff apologist Daniel Ray.
What's eating in the universe? That's a question and a title of physicist Paul Davies' 2021 short book about the universe, one he and many other astrophysicists cannot finally answer. But what does the question even mean? Well, our present understanding of the universe is that at its most distant visible edges, if you will, it appears to be surrounded by an oval-shaped shell of light astrophysicists call the cosmic microwave background radiation. It is allegedly the leftover sparks from the initial beginning of the universe, or the Big Bang. Think of a 4th of July fireworks explosion. You see a shower of sparks burst forth from the center. Those sparks form something of a spherical or oval shape as they cool and eventually disappear. Roughly speaking, the temperature of each of those individual tendrils at any given moment would be about the same, say about 800 degrees Fahrenheit on average. More or less, this is what the cosmic microwave background radiation is like. Now try to imagine that in the midst of the sphere of hot fireworks sparks, there is a significantly large area of sparks that are only about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You would certainly be scratching your head in wonder as to how a hot, dense firework explosion, made up of mostly 800 degree sparks, could be responsible for such an unexpected and unusual temperature anomaly. This is roughly the puzzle facing astrophysicists regarding the massive cold spot in the cosmic microwave background radiation. How could a hot, dense Big Bang produce such a bizarre temperature anomaly? As Davies describes it, the spot looks like some, quote, cosmic giant has taken a huge bite out of the universe, end quote. To this day, while there are some ideas floating around about why this spot exists and how it might have come to be, there hasn't been any explanation put forth that has conclusively solved this mystery. A significant challenge in the science of the heavens has always been related to man's conceptual models of the universe versus the actual nature of the universe. And as the history of scientific discovery shows, we as human beings are often prone to holding on to our limited understanding, preferring to accept the models we have made rather than acquiesce to the nature of reality as it really is. So in the case of the cold spot in the cosmic microwave background radiation, perhaps there was no Big Bang. Maybe this enigmatic background radiation isn't what scientists assume it is. So the question before the astronomical community is today, should they try to interpret this cold spot to make it fit their conceptual model of the universe, or should they consider the cold spot to be enough of a significant challenge to their model and allow the data to overturn their long-held assumptions? Of course, it would not be easy for a lone scientist or two to step outside the confines of the accepted conceptual models of the universe. After all, a cadre of their peers, including themselves, have dedicated their lives to defending and upholding the current models. Change would not come easy. So today, when it comes to answering Jesus' questions to his disciples about his identity, who do men say that I am, and who do you say that I am, New Testament scholars who are not Christians are faced with a similar conundrum. A literal bodily resurrection from the dead is something of an unexplained cold spot in their historical models, one for which there is no formidable alternative explanation. Becoming a Christian in such an environment, accepting the resurrection, would likely involve being ostracized by one's fellow liberal scholars. How one sees the resurrection of Jesus, then, largely depends not so much on the historical evidence, but on a person's worldview, a conceptual model we use to understand, interpret, and explain the world as we see it. And since the late 19th century, there have been a cadre of New Testament scholars whose worldviews have influenced them to set aside the Apostle Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. They have replaced that traditional confession with their own individual confessions about who they think Jesus is. You are a social or political revolutionary, an apocalyptic prophet, a guru, a cynic, or a manifestation of God consciousness. But of course, none of these confessions are in line with the mainstream Orthodox confession that Jesus is both fully God and fully man, Lord and Savior, who was raised bodily from the grave. So is there anything good that can come out of reading or studying what these liberal scholars with an unorthodox view of Jesus have to say? According to our very special guest this week and next, Dr. Gary Habermas, the world's leading scholar on the resurrection of Jesus, the answer is a resounding 1,000-page yes. Gary has spent a lifetime reading and studying nearly every liberal scholar since the late 19th century who does not hold to a literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. He has just published Volume 1 of a proposed 4-volume set on the resurrection, The Evidences. And in reading and studying these scholars over the years, Gary discovered a curious pattern, namely that these scholars, despite their denial of Jesus' bodily resurrection from the dead, nevertheless were continuing to affirm the trustworthy historicity of certain events related to Jesus' life, death, and subsequent resurrection. In other words, even though these scholars for the most part deny the central event of the Christian faith as having actually happened in history, they nevertheless affirm a great deal about what we find in the Gospel accounts and the New Testament in general. So much so that Gary has been able to build a case he has called over the years the minimal facts argument. These are certain facts taken from the New Testament that a majority of liberal scholars who deny a bodily resurrection nonetheless accept as historical bedrock. They are that Jesus died by crucifixion, that his disciples had believed they had seen Jesus alive after his death, that the message of Jesus rising from the dead was proclaimed very early after his crucifixion, that the lives of Jesus' disciples were radically transformed, and that Jesus' brother James, who doubted Jesus prior to his death, came to believe that his earthly brother was also the divine Lord and Messiah, and lastly, that the murderous Jewish Pharisee Saul became a follower of Christ and a proclaimer of the way he formerly persecuted after an appearance of the risen Jesus to him on the road to Damascus. Agnostic atheist and New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman, for example, routinely affirms that Jesus did in fact exist. As he wrote in his 1999 book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, quote, "Jesus was born, and he did die," end quote. Though Ehrman believes there are discrepancies in these narratives, he still finds enough credible information throughout the New Testament he considers to be historically trustworthy. And such is the case with all of the scholars surveyed in Habermas's work. Though the physical bodily resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ from the dead remains a mysterious cold spot in the background worldviews of the scholars featured in On the Resurrection, one for which there is presently no tenable natural hypothesis, Gary believes that these scholars should not simply be discarded. As he proposes, they have important historical contributions to offer believers who are willing to engage them. Here on Part 1, Gary and I talk about the tools historians use when examining the texts of the New Testament and how a historian's worldview impacts how they apply those tools and the conclusions they reach. I loved how you started with the book. You take 3 chapters to unpack sort of the philosophy and the background about how we do history. It's kind of coming into the kitchen, Gary, and showing people how we make sausage. I found a YouTube video of an atheist who was saying that he had read it, And I wrote a little article about that. But one thing that struck me, Gary, right off the bat, was historical criteria. And the way this atheist, and what was really eye-opening is because I was reading these chapters about the philosophy of history, and then I watched this atheist's video, and what was clear to me, so clear to me, and your book was so helpful about this, is that in order to come at the New Testament and to try to make it seem historically untrustworthy, he just seemed to be picking and choosing what kind of criteria he would use to make something credible or not credible.
Yep.
And as I was reading your book and watched that video, I realized that the scholars that you feature, who are not Christians or who are marginally Christian, will make historical criteria or attempt to make historical criteria far more subjective and unreliable. So they're right off the bat, they're messing with the tools before they even get to the text of the New Testament. And I thought maybe we could chat a little bit about the philosophy of history and what those criteria are that we are using to come at the resurrection of Jesus. There is this criteria, but then there's always, if there's a question about whether or not something is historical, it always boils down to a question of worldview or how your worldview is impacting the tools that you're using.
It does, because one of the big things now is half of these atheists who are doing the arguing, I get the feeling talking to them, they just haven't stopped to realize that they have a worldview. They usually deny they have a worldview. And as I told one of them in a debate, he was getting me ticked because he kept saying, I don't have a worldview. I'm only saying I don't believe yours. That's what atheist means. I'm not you. That's all it means. I said, no, if you didn't have a worldview, you couldn't talk. You don't have a position. And I said, you know something? He was in the English literature field, atheist. And he said, I said, you know something? Why don't you help yourself and go back and take a course in philosophy? And then I stopped and I said, probably an intro course would cure you of saying that baloney. In other words, a little bit of a put down, but I was tired of him saying he had nothing. Now, one thing, it depends on who you talk to. The criteria are accepted by probably the greatest number of critical researchers. There are a few that go off on it. There's a debate on it right now. The crazy thing is the guys that often go off on them use them in their own works. So I don't know I don't think anybody knows right now where the stopping and starting is, who uses how much. And I will say this at first too, and I'll try to divide them this way as I define them. There's a hierarchy, and 3 or 4 of them at the top are way more respected than the 6 or 8 or 10 below these first 4. The first 4 or 5, you can't deny him and still be doing historical Jesus because you have to use these rules. So if I were just to lay these out, 2 that I put at the top, now I will tell you right off the bat, almost no critics do this because they don't think we have either one of them. But if we had them, they'd say, oh, that's incredibly important. But I don't think we have any of that, with the exception of the Apostle Paul. Because the first 2 I would put above all the others is when you're doing history, and I do this in those chapters very carefully, you would like early and eyewitness testimony. Those are 2, I think they're the 2 most important things. Now, a variety of caveats. We can know early witnesses could be wrong. Early witnesses could have made stuff up and not known it. Early witnesses could have made stuff up and knew what they were doing. But early is better than late, undeniably. And an eyewitness is better than a non-eyewitness. Now, some eyewitnesses get it wrong, but you still go to them rather than somebody later.
Well, it's like the point Bart Ehrman makes, and just to interject about the eyewitness part, Ehrman has said, and I know you've heard it, that eyewitness testimony generally, in order to make the Gospels a little bit more subjective, that we can't really rely on eyewitness testimony because eyewitness testimony tends to be unreliable, especially when we're talking about miracle claims. So I wish I could have asked Dr. Ehrman when I heard him say this that it seems that he is an eyewitness of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony.
He makes a lot of positive statements about eyewitnesses.
Sure. Well, you need it. It's our judicial system is based on.
Here's a couple examples. He says, almost every critical scholar says this, our only author of a New Testament book who was around at that time was Paul. Paul is by far the best author. Everybody else is second and third generation. And that's why they're so good in Greek. Who knows? But we doubt Peter the fisherman and somebody else could speak Greek as fluently as those books do. But Paul's good. And when Bart is talking about Paul visiting Jerusalem to spend 15 days with Peter and James, Bart makes the little quip. He says, I wished I could go to Jerusalem and have spent 15 days with Peter and James. And then he says, where do we get closer to the eyewitnesses than this? Mm-hmm. And that's in his book, Did Jesus Exist? So right away, he values an interview with not just Paul, he values Paul's interview with James and Peter, especially Peter, and he values eyewitness testimony behind Paul. So I say early in eyewitness. And here's a story I often tell. You've probably heard me do it in lectures. I'll say, early in eyewitness, you can't say, oh, that's one rule. No, they're very different rules. And here's an example. I heard of a guy who did his memoirs of World War II. Now, my dad was over there in World War II, Special Forces, and so was my father-in-law. He was a Green Beret. Those guys saw this stuff firsthand. But this guy was there. He was an eyewitness, but he wrote his memoirs, I believe, in 1990-ish. Now, he's an eyewitness, but that's not early. That's an eyewitness 45 years later. So, and somebody might say, well, 45 is still good. Really? Do you think that? Then why do you knock the Gospel of Mark? Oh, well, see, it comes back on him. But so early and eyewitness are not the same. But I would start with those two. If you have early eyewitness sources, they're best. Okay. I'd say the next one, you can overdo it, but I'd say the next one is multiple attestation. And we would popularly call it the two heads are better than one rule. I would rather get three people agreeing on what happened in this car accident than one person agreeing on what happened. We're having that problem right there with the court case right now where there's no witness to back up the main witness. Well, if you don't have a witness for your witness, what are we supposed to do? Just say, I'll try to believe him? We want backup. And backup, so eyewitnesses back up. The date of attestation is back up early. Multiple sources are early. And critics do not count sources the way evangelicals do. If you say to a normal evangelical pastor who hasn't toyed with this stuff, they'd say, oh, well, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle besides the resurrection that is recorded in all four Gospels. Okay, footnote. Somebody could say, well, Mark doesn't have appearances, but that's not what I said. Mark records the resurrection. He said he's not here, he's not dead, he's risen, and you'll see him. So all four have the resurrection, the fact, and all four have the feeding of the 5,000. So critics will, sometimes evangelical pastors will do this. So right there, I've got four sources. No, you don't. You've got two. What? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. No, you got two. Because it's widely believed, evangelicals and non-evangelicals, that Matthew and Luke used Mark at that point. So I do this with my doctoral students. If it's in Mark, what's it called? Mark. If it's in Matthew and Mark, what's it called? Mark. If it's in Mark and Luke, what's it called? Mark. If it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's called Mark. If it's in Mark and Luke, it's Mark. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's Luke. So far, we got one out of three. John is independent. So John's number two. And we have Mark, to pick one example. Mark says Jesus' brothers didn't believe him. So that twice, Mark 3, Mark 6. John says it in John 7. that's multiple attestation. That's two sources. But if you also have Matthew and Luke telling Mark's story, that doesn't increase your sources. Not the way even evangelicals and evangelical seminaries do it.
So if I can put it colloquially for our audience, Gary, it's like, let's say we have a White House press conference, and there's an Associated Press reporter who asks a question, records the information, and then the Associated Press story might get run by the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times or Time Magazine. But no matter how many sources run that AP story, the source is the Associated Press. That's one source, not the LA Times, the New York Times, or the Time Magazine.
You know that if they cite the original source, or if all their wording looks like they've been looking over each other's shoulders, because you know they're quoting a common source, even if they don't use the number of the source. So those are the three biggies.
And to your point there, to further solidify it, why would the LA Times, New York Times, and Time Magazine be republishing the Associated Press article? Because it's important, right? So the source copying material suggests that there's something super important to be conveyed here. Is that kind of what is that even?
That's a great point. And Matthew gives Mark honor by citing Mark. Luke gives Mark honor by citing Mark. Now, some people say, well, if Matthew's a disciple like you cocky evangelicals think he is, why would he be using a non-disciple author, Mark? Okay, first of all, the authorship of Matthew is probably the single toughest question among the Gospels. So we'd have to solve that one. But secondly, if Mark, according to Papias, who wrote, according to almost all scholars, about 25 years after the Gospel of John, so very early, when he wrote and he said, Mark's main source were the sermons and teachings of Peter. Even if Matthew wrote Matthew could be quote unquote bowing in a, kudos to you kind of way to Mark's having used Peter, because Peter was in a sense Matthew's boss in the 12. If we use illustration, it's interesting. I noticed in a issue of The Chosen the other day, when Jesus walks away, all the disciples are talking. They can't solve something, and Peter, who's called a hothead, that's what's called. Peter goes, ho 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 ho. Let's think about this. You guys are all, and he summarized everybody's words and put it into an order, and they're going, yeah, that's right. So that's similar to anything.
Well,
Matthew
so
might be giving respect to Peter.
So I see what I'm hearing, Gary, and this is just kind of crystallizing as you're talking. Jesus, we have in the gospel that Jesus says to Peter, "On this rock, I will build my church." That can't be small potatoes for what we're talking about here. Maybe that's why we have such a thing as Markian priority, because Mark copies the guy who is the stone, the foundation, the one who Jesus showed a certain kind of favor that maybe excited some jealousy among the disciples. But it seems like Peter was, if you're going to quote anybody, you're going to quote from Peter. Now, it does leave us with the question of why was Mark's name affixed to this, and why didn't, if Mark is being a secretary for Peter, why don't we have Peter's name on that gospel?
Well, he's deceased now, but one prominent New Testament scholar, British New Testament scholar, in his introduction to the New Testament, called the second gospel, he called it the Gospel of Peter according to John Mark. That's what he called it. I think that's getting at what you're saying.
It is. But it would seem to me Peter in his later days would sort of demur that, because Mark is embarrassing toward Peter. I mean, Peter, it's not flattering. It's not a flattering account of Peter. And none of the Gospels, I mean, that's another one of the criteria that impressed me the most in your book, was the criteria of embarrassment that you see throughout the Gospel accounts. and the New Testament. Paul, an enemy of the church, Jesus not being able to perform. I mean, Mark records the scene where Jesus goes to his hometown and he couldn't perform many miracles there because of their unbelief. Now, if this is the Savior of the world, if this is God incarnate, why do you have a scene, a vignette where he can't do miracles? That was really something that impressed me was how you laid out the case for these criteria, but especially the embarrassment, because these don't read like embellishments, Gary. They don't read like this. This is what adds to the authenticity of what we're looking at in the gospel accounts.
A critic is not going to criticize, by and large, will not criticize early eyewitness or multiple if you have that. Those three are standbys. But they sometimes go over enemy attestation, and they sometimes go over embarrassment. For example, we already did one of them. Why would Mark record once in Mark 3 and once in Mark 6 that Jesus' own brothers didn't believe in him? Why would John record that in John 7? Well, critics will often say, and rightly so, if any of us write novels, we could do this often. You make your chief character, he gets embarrassed by somebody who doesn't agree with him, and he goes back and does research and finds out the guy's right, and here's what you learn about your main character. He's not too big to ask forgiveness, number one. And number two, he went back and studied and got the thing right. So they'll say, sometimes novelists will work embarrassment and enemy attestation into the stories for the benefit of their hero or heroine at the end. So lesser ones would be some of those. Embarrassment, enemy, but almost everybody uses them because they're good. They're good rules. I mean, think about the things the Gospels really do embarrass people. James, the pastor of the church of Jerusalem, had a reputation in the early church for being an extremely godly man, and he can't even believe Jesus growing up. I mean, that's embarrassing. Peter denies him 3 times. Why not make it Judas Iscariot? Well, of course, he's already off the scene there, but why not make it some lesser guy, Simon the Zealot? Why not make him the one that denies? Don't take the big guy that we have to trust later in church. But they do that. John the Baptist is in prison. Eventually, he's going to lose his head.
He has doubts.
He sends his disciples to Jesus and said, "Are you the Messiah?" That was a rough question. But how about the second part of it? Are you the Messiah, or should we look for another? Because Jesus, I'm not trying to get in trouble with you, but there's this guy down the street. I just heard about him. His name's Buddha. And hey, I'm not talking you down. I'm just wondering. I mean, and Jesus calls him the most righteous man ever born. So enemy and embarrassing, I think, are good, but like nothing compares to me to early eyewitness and multiple attestation are the biggies. Some of the lesser ones I don't have a lot of use for at all.
Yeah.
Non-philosophers like coherence. Does the story hang together well? Well,
Lord of the Rings hangs together. Fictional stories hang together.
How about this? How about name 3 cults, 3 world religions, Christianity, and let's just concede, at least in this one story, they all hang together well. Are they all true?
Right.
If they're not, that makes me question coherence.
Yeah.
Or your example, Lord of the Rings, that's a really good example. So I don't like coherence. Multiple attestation is big, but there's also another one that critics use, multiple types of sources. If your argument uses didactic teaching, a parable, a miracle, and these are separate stories, the more of those you use, the more complete the text looks. I just find that to be rather silly. Why can't I make my hero or heroine in my novel partake in a bunch of things? He's the best shot in the hunting contest. He's the best basketball player. When they come together to play, he can dunk the ball over everybody's head. He can do everything. That just helps me develop my hero more. I don't think that different kinds of stories. So I don't like, I put that one at the end of my list. And I say so in that big book. That one's further down. Coherence is further down for me. So there's, to me, maybe 3 demarcations. But still, almost everybody who puts them down today uses them.
Yeah.
I give a list there in the book. I think I give like a dozen in the book.
Okay.
And there's more than that. There's probably 20 or 25.
Yeah.
Some people think one of the criteria is, why did Jesus die? Things that point to why Jesus died. I don't see that as a criteria, but I think that's very useful, because a lot of the critics say he died for political insurrection. Really? Yeah, because even if they misinterpreted him, they thought that he might have an army right over that hill that's going to come down as soon as he says the magic word. They thought it was that, but they can't bring themselves to say, Mark 10:45, I came to give my life a ransom for many. They just don't want to hear him say that he was teaching substitutionary atonement. They don't want that in there. They'd rather say political insurrection. So these come up when you're solving the difference between those questions.
Gotcha. I hear a lot of atheists say, Gary, and you have too, I just believe in one less God than you do. And as I was reading your book, I had that in the back of my mind, and I'm thinking, I mean, this book is, I can honestly say, and I've read a lot, I haven't read everything, but there's probably not anything out there that has such a collection of liberal-leaning, atheist, agnostic, New Testament scholars in one place. I mean, to me, that is an accomplishment by itself. But what was interesting, Gary, is I'm reading the collective thinking of these people, from the Jesus Seminar, from David Strauss all the way to Bart Ehrman, 130 years of New Testament critical scholarship. I'm thinking to myself that this absolutely, if you need an argument to shatter the atheist statement that they just believe in one less God than we do, here is something that really distinguishes and I think completely dismantles the idea that all the other gods are just like ours. Because as I'm reading your book, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, well, if all God claims are about the same mythical, influential, mythical legend kind of thing, it doesn't seem to me that all criticism of these gods are the same, because where is the voluminous body of work of scholars who are dismantling the existence of Zeus or Apollo or Poseidon? It seems that this cadre that you have compiled together, it's like a museum of liberalism, Gary, that you put together. And as I'm reading this, I'm just thinking to myself that this is like a kind of Gethsemane of liberal scholars on their knees in the garden, sweating drops of ink, trying to make this cup of the crucifixion and resurrection pass from them. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like, you're the detective from inner city Detroit with the pictures of all these guys on your wall, and you're just grilling them. You put them in the chair, and you're using their own words against them to show us, Gary, that the historical reliability of the text that we have before us is so obvious. These scholars, no matter their best efforts, cannot get rid of the fact that there is a lot. This is superior history, and yet they cannot conclude that Jesus actually rose from the dead. That was fascinating to me.
And why not? Because to me, clearly, go back to that debates you and I have had, or people we've talked to who just say, this is a certain species of it, not a Bart Ehrman, but one of the mythicist types who would say, I'm an atheist. All that means is I'm not you. All that means is I'm not a theist. I don't have a worldview. I'm just telling you your perspective is wrong. Okay, time out. If you don't have a worldview, you don't have a perspective, and there's facts for the resurrection. Those 6 facts that I used, the minimal facts, if I remember my notes correctly, there's an average. I know some people just think I'm crazy for doing this, but there's an average of almost 15 independent or almost independent evidences per fact on the 6. That's why everybody believes them. All right, if you can't realize that these 6 are solid because it's 75 different arguments between the six, and they're almost all independent or nearly so, as Bart Ehrman likes to say. And I compliment him on that. He says the arguments I'm using are independent or nearly so. Okay, so are mine. That's the way I'm going to do it. And they go, no, 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 no. You don't have a worldview, but you won't believe because if you do, something's going to mess with this thing that I call a worldview that you don't, but you don't want your life changing because you want to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and Christians despise that. Most people reject from doubt studies I do. These dovetail, but I didn't do them for the resurrection. I've got 3 books on doubt, and I've worked with thousands of doubters, and there's 3 guys that have ministries spinning off talking to doubters, so I don't have to talk to them. When you talk with these people, they might deny they have a worldview, but they don't want to believe because what it would do to their lifestyle, what it would do to their beliefs, what it would do to who they're supposed to vote on in the election, who they're supposed to marry, the freedom. And some of them are just plain angry at thinking there's a God who bosses you around. You don't call that a worldview? Mm-hmm. You're not believing for other reasons. I don't hear you disputing the facts. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 different things going on here. And as long as they want to play the not on my worldview, I forgot I don't have a worldview. As long as you want to play that game, it just looks silly to people that understand what worldviews are, that the moves these people are making. And I'm talking about the real radicals that Bart Ehrman himself goes off on, and no less than 20 pages in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He goes off on these guys. And he says, Bart, I'm speaking positively about Bart, if anybody's missing this. Bart says, these people, these mythicists, they're upset that we're not reading their self-published books and making use of them because they're so brilliant. He said they don't understand. They don't have a foothold in this discussion. They don't even have a toehold. That's what Bart says about them. They don't even have a toehold. They're wondering why Bart and others aren't backing them. And Bart says, I don't want anything to do with you. So if you don't recognize you have a worldview, that puts you somewhere else on the ladder than where most scholars are, even unbelievers.
So your book is, and this is another way of, it's fun because when I read a book, I don't like to just spit back what it says, because your words processed through my brain come out a certain way. It's like this is how God communicates through the Gospels and through the disciples, that his word is unique and it's pure and it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but yet the personality of the people are there. And so in a lot of ways, Gary, you were shaping my, I mean, I'm going to be forever shaped in a certain direction by the words that you have written. And one of the things one of the sort of ways I interpreted how you were doing this work as I'm reading this, I'm like, how did he do this? You actually, I'll put it this way, you cross enemy lines, you go put on the liberal thinking cap, you go into the liberal halls of liberal academia, you go all the way back to late 19th century David Strauss. This is post-Darwinian Enlightenment development in the Western culture, and you learn their language, you speak their language, you understand their language, you demonstrate that you know the culture in which these people operate. So you're very thorough you're not just coming at liberals with an evangelical agenda. You literally take on the voice of these people. And in fact, Gary, what I think is masterful about the work that you've done, I don't mean to be overly flattery or complimentary about this, but this is literally the way I was thinking about this. You have let these people in their own language. Basically, it's like poetry. You come behind their words, interpret their words accurately, and then using their own language, show us just how historically reliable the Gospels and the resurrection really are. I compliment you on that, to be able to take the words of these people, to A, understand them properly, and to B, show us how they can point us to the historical bedrock of the resurrection. Was just it's a life's work, Gary, as you know. So you pulled that off very well.
Well, Daniel, yeah, I pull it off. Why do I pull it off? Well, I had to do a lot of research to think of their minds, but I can think as a liberal.
Yes, you
better
can.
than I can think as an evangelical. And there's a reason for that. I went through doubt for the greater part of 10 years and a lesser percentage of 10 more years. But all told, I went through doubt for about 20 years. And I'm starting to tell the story now. I was embarrassed to tell it before, but now I've told it in a lot of places. When I say to people, I almost became a Buddhist. Some people might think, oh, come on, you were 16 years old probably, and you didn't know anything, and you almost became a Buddhist because you didn't know any better. Time out. I almost became a Buddhist after I got my PhD, after doing my dissertation on the resurrection. That's when Buddhism, and not just any old Buddhism, not the teachings of the guy that lived centuries before Jesus, but a type of Buddhism that said, a type of an argument that said Buddhism is a proper metaphysics for contemporary physics, science, a very sophisticated kind. I already had my PhD. I'd already done major things on the resurrection. So the reason I know these liberals is because I was there. I was them. That's how I thought. I used to debate Christians. I would get Christians angry at me because I'd say, look, loser. And I would talk like this. Look, why do you call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John 4 when there's 2? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, come on. If you're going to go out and talk to unbelievers, at least know what you're talking about. And I would say sometimes bombastic things because I was ticked that they didn't give me straight answers when I was talking. And it bothers me when they're trying to feed me the same stuff that never convinced me when they gave it to me. One time, I tell this less, but one time my favorite professor, dearly loved this guy. He was trying to say the Bible was inerrant. And I had rejected inerrancy during those times. I don't mean almost became a Buddhist and didn't, which is true, but I mean rejected inerrancy. I have a definition of inspiration I wrote when I had rejected inerrancy. I still have the anti-inerrancy statement I wrote in my file. And I went into his office, and my best friend was with me because he was also a campus skeptic in a Christian school. I spent only 5 semesters in the Christian school. All the rest of my stuff was secular. And I got this guy red-faced that I wasn't meaning to, but he's my favorite professor. And I said, dude, when I ask you how I believe the Bible's inerrant, you give me verses. Then when I ask you why the verses are true, you give me verses. And then when I ask you, how can I trust any of these verses, you give me more verses. That does not help me. It does not help me to cite your literature to prove your literature. We have a name for that in philosophy. It's called circular. And I went off on this guy, and he was red-faced. And thankfully, I met him years later. I was speaking at his school that he went on to teach another school, a very prestigious school. And I met him, and I told him, I said, I still resent that conversation I had because I loved you, your favorite professor, and I didn't want to be going off on you, but that's who I was. So I think like that far better than as people who give what I think are tried answers and don't know where they're coming from.
You've been listening to Apologetics Profile, a podcast ministry of Watchman Fellowship, Incorporated. For more information about our ministry and resources, visit our website at watchman.org.